lot this morning. We're going to talk a little bit more. We're going to be starting in the book of Genesis. If you need a Bible, you can raise your hand. Are we okay with the fans? Is that good? We open the doors in the back too. Charlotte doesn't know what to do with its weather right now, so I requested warm and sunny today, but we got a little too warm apparently. Are we okay with the fans still on? Should we turn them off? Keep them on? Okay. I was sweating, and so then I just want to make sure you're comfortable, because I sweat pretty much nonstop. So we're in this we just finished a justice series. We're in a larger series called Citizens, and this is a big piece that we're trying to press into. And the question that we've had over and over that I've had, and I've encouraged you to have, is what does it look like to be a citizen in God's kingdom? And this is our first citizenship, and this often comes against our other citizenships that we have and other titles that we have. American, father, husband, employee, friend, child, sibling, whatever they are. We say the first importance is this idea as a child of God and as a citizen in His kingdom. And this week and next week, we're going to look at a topic that for me is really, really dear to my heart. A little bit of our story, really briefly. And coming to Charlotte was this idea, the word first came to me with the word wild. And me and Kristen were praying and just kind of praying about this church, and some pictures came up that were wild, and I was like, I don't know what that means. A few months later, we kept praying about it, and really clearly God put on our heart what it would look like to be a diverse church. And if you know me at all, I'm from South Alabama, from a mostly white town. There were 2 African Americans that attended my high school. I went then to Indiana, which was a very similar experience ethnically. I then spent time in Southern California, which is not as much African American as it is Hispanic and Asian and Caucasian, and then came back and had that prayer before we got to Charlotte. And then coming to Charlotte and seeing the racial complexity of the city, where it's like 45% Caucasian, 45% African American, and then 10% everything else. And just like, what is our call as a church? And partly me saying, God, I don't think that I'm the right guy. I wasn't raised in diverse circumstances. I don't know. Some of you are raised, and you're like, yeah, what about this? And I go, I'm learning all of it. And so a couple of things before we jump into it that I just want to make really clear is that this is 3 years or so now of me trying to learn. And trying to ask that question, though I haven't asked it properly. God, I'm your child. I'm a citizen in your kingdom. What do you have for me and the church that you've called me to lead, and for your church in general? And so I present all of this to you with the understanding that probably in a year I'll look back on the sermon and be like, I wish I would have said it differently. And then in 3 years, man, I wish I would never have said that one piece. And probably in 5 years, I wish I could really go back and just take that one off. But I would just toss this out there. You're probably the same way. You can look at like a decision you made this morning, and you're like, I wish I wouldn't have done that, right? Or a year, like we're all hopefully getting wiser in our lives. And so I just want to, this isn't the like magnum opus of diversity in the church for you to like take down and share with all of your friends. You can share it with some of them if you want. Secondly, the big picture of diversity that I've seen so far in the text, and we're not going to get into this too much, but in a minute, we see humanity created in Genesis 1 and 2 as fully interdependent beings. Adam and Eve are one couple that have perfect relationship with each other, with themselves, with nature, and with God. Sin then enters the world and ruins it. And notice that God didn't create separate but equal Adam and Eves. He didn't create an African American and a Caucasian and an Asian and Hispanic Adam and Eve. He created one, and then sin happened, and it kind of spread everything and ruined it. And it broke all of the relationships. And then the story from basically Genesis 4 until the end of the Bible, which is the end of the Old Testament, which is Malachi, is God's plan of restoring this creation. And we know who it is. We know it's Jesus. We then read about him in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and all the things that he's doing. And he's restoring and redeeming and capturing people for himself. And then we can read the story of the church, starting in Acts and then ending right before Revelation. And this idea of what does it look like for redeemed people to help other people be redeemed and restored. And this idea throughout the whole thing is shalom. That in Genesis we see shalom, and it's not just peace. That's a negative word because it means absence of conflict. It means wholeness and filling and fulfillment and those things. And then we look in Revelation, and I don't know if you're aware of this. I was getting a little wrecked this morning from the worship set. All 3 of those songs were basically Revelation 5 through 7. And in Revelation 5, it says, this guy John writes the book of Revelation, if you're new to the church, and he's on an island and has a vision of what heaven's going to be like. And he's writing these things down, and it's kind of, I've heard people say it's kind of like watching a baseball game in the 1990s and trying to talk about it in 1990 BC. There were 9 guys in matching outfits with these things on their hands. They all had really enlarged one hand and then a really small other hand. Like, how do you define it if you've never seen it before? So we try and read it, but in Revelation 5, it says this. It says, and I'm waiting, and they said, behold, the Lion of Judah. We sang the song Lion and the Lamb, but then what happens next? What does John see? He doesn't see a lion. He sees a slain lamb. And this idea that, like, yeah, we expect this like courageous lion to be dominant, and then the thing that shows up, and it says slain, like a bloody lamb. Like the opposite of a roaring lion would be a bloody lamb. And then 5 and 6 goes through all these scrolls, which are prophetic and really hard to interpret. And then chapter 7 is one of the famous ones, especially for diversity. He says, and then countless numbers of people from every tribe, tongue, and nation worshiping in one voice to the Lamb. And then there's this awesome chorus that I pray that I get to hear someday. Of everybody singing, and it doesn't say all in the same language. It doesn't say all with the same instrument and no organs and only electric guitars or like only a small drum, not a whole kit, right? It doesn't differ. It says everybody together in one voice praising that Lamb. And so we as a church, and me really passionately, I'm already getting a little pumped up. From Genesis to the wholeness and perfect shalom to revelation of what it's going to be like, we say that's what we should be as people. That's what we're created to be, and that's where we're going. And we want to be in that direction. And I'm really open to all of you giving feedback and like, well, what about this? And how do you address this? And just honestly say, I'm not really sure. Like, if you have questions, and we're going to talk today about an issue of that with race. And the questions that come up with race and what they might be, and maybe you hear race and you're like, oh, I have a friend that, you know, when I talk about race, he goes, well, why don't you, it seems like that's the in vogue thing to do as a church. I'll tell you it's not. It's harder. The easy way to grow a church is to make it all mono-ethnic and do all awesome Chris Tomlin and Hillsong songs and have a great sermon that's like 22 or 25 minutes. Never preach that short, come on. But that would make the church grow really fast, and we could do that. But the idea of diversity is hard and it's challenging, but we see this beautiful picture. And even the ask of that we're saying of you is, instead of saying, what does it look like to be a diverse church? Or what does it look like to be a citizen in God's kingdom? Some statistics, too, when we get into it. In case this is your first time with it. 90% of American churches draw 90% of their people from one ethnic group. Of those, they define a diverse church as a church which no one ethnic group is more than 80% of the congregation. So if you have 75% Caucasian, your church can be diverse, as it's called. 13.7% of U.S. congregations qualify as multi-ethnic. But of those, that's all churches, not just Protestant churches. Non-Christian congregations are about 27% multi-ethnic. Catholic are about 15%, and Protestant churches, which is what we are about 5% multi-ethnic. According with that too, most of those that are multi-ethnic are still a majority white, so there's very few like African American dominant multi-ethnic churches, Hispanic dominant multi-ethnic, etc. But then this is the other stat that you had on there, is that 67% of Christians think their church is doing enough to be ethnically diverse. And so you take those two stats, most churches aren't diverse, even 80%, and most people think the church is doing enough to be diverse. Right? So the answer is most churches are racially homogenous, and most Christians think that's okay. And I'm just going to throw that out, and you might say, I'm writing this morning, I'm revising it. I didn't start this morning. And I had this thought, and maybe you have this thought. Well, our churches should be predominantly white and Caucasian because we live in the United States, and we're a predominantly white and Caucasian country, at least now. And I had that thought. I go, well, what about that question? And I would say that's a valid one. But the premise that I challenge myself, and I would challenge you, is what kingdom are you counting first? Sure, American culture, if you want to have a church that's very American, you would probably speak like 70, 65% English. I don't know what the statistics are. You would do things pretty much a white way, but we're not a United States, a church of United States. We're a church of Jesus Christ, right? And we're trying to be in His kingdom, not in our American kingdoms. And so even like if you have objections, I have them too. I don't know how to do it, and I'm trying to walk along with you. So, all of that to say, this is going to be fun. Genesis 1. Turn there with me. Genesis 1, verse 27. We see the original call for Adam and Eve. Are we okay? Super tense and uncomfortable. I've got a good one today, though. I'm really excited. Genesis 1, verse 27. It says, "So God created mankind." First off, I think it's going to be good. You might, at the end of it, be like, that wasn't good. That's fine. "So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them." This is the first statement of an original Adam and Eve, that this is God's creation and the way that order should go. And notice here, He doesn't create, like I just said, separate but equal Adam and Eves. Adam and Eve are together. They are different. He'll later on say that they help each other in ways that they can't do it themselves. And this is the idea of shalom. The guy Stephen Covey is an author. He uses the word interdependent. And he defines it this way. He says, dependent people need others to get what they want. Independent people get what they want through their own effort, but interdependent people combine their own efforts with the efforts of others to achieve the greatest success. And so you're like, well, Adam could have done really great on his own. Sure. Eve could have done really great on their own. Eve could have been really dependent on Adam and done fine. Adam could have been really dependent on Eve and done fine. But if they identify their own strengths and respect each other's strengths, they have something greater than they ever could alone. And we know that's true in marriage, and we would say that that applies also to our race and our people in general. The word Adam literally just means humanity. And so this idea can be transferred over to say all of humanity is made not as independent vessels or something like that. It's this interdependence that we have with each other. Jump to Genesis 10. In Genesis 10, or actually the last verse of Genesis 9, we see the story of Noah. And if you're new to the church, there's a story about a big boat, and it rains for a long time, and everybody in the world, other than the people on the boat, don't make it. And it can be a really tragic. I mean, it's funny, I heard Francis Chan talking about it, like we have the flannel graph of Noah and his animals, but we don't include all the like people in the water that are being massacred, and like, it's just a really, really stark image sometimes. But after we get through that, we have Noah, and he has 3 sons. Read Genesis 9, verse 59. I think they'll have it up on the screen. I sent it this morning, we'll see if they had it in time. We got it? Genesis 9, verse 59, it says, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. 29 says, and Noah lived a total of 950 years, and then he died. And then verse 1 of Genesis 10 says this. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. And if you remember, a couple weeks ago, we talked about how at the flood, God scatters all of creation. And now Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And all of them, over the next 2 chapters, are going to be something, I learned this term, you can jot this down if you're a note taker. Genesis 10 and 11 is called the Table of Nations. And it starts with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then they go into descriptive categories of what their descendants are. And they use 4 broad categories that might be in there. One of them is racial descent. One of them is geographic location. Another is linguistic differences. And the 4th are political organizations. And these 3 descending lines, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, descend over all of the modern Middle East. It includes Africa, it includes the Middle East, it includes Europe, it includes parts of Eurasia and into like where Russia is today and almost over to India. You can look up a map of the Table of Nations and get Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And as a side note that's not connected to this sermon at all, Shem is the oldest son. He becomes the father or descendant of a guy named Eber, E-B-E-R, who then becomes the descendant of a guy named Abram, who becomes Abraham. And those 2 words, Shem and Eber, are interesting if you're like a history. I like trivia because it's trivial. Shem is where we get the word Semite. So if somebody's anti-Semitic, it's against Jewish people, racist towards Jews, that's anti-Semitic. That's where the word Semitic comes from, a Shem. And the word Hebrew originates from the word Eber. So if you speak Hebrew, or if you're a Jewish person, you can be called a Hebrew as well. So that's the family line that the Bible then follows, is this guy Shem. But in this table of nations, chapter 10 and 11, they say there's scholars, I didn't count, there's more than 70 different nationalities that get represented under these three sons. And this is the idea of God scattering. He's not punishing them. He's saying, hey, go and scatter and do different things and organize yourself different politically and speak different languages and do all these things. And right in the middle of 10 and 11, we find a story that we all know really well. Turn to Genesis 11, verse 1. Your Bible might have a little subtitle. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. If you don't know about Babel, if you're new to the church, it's this building that they built. It was really tall. And God didn't like it very much. And we're going to see why here in just a sec. So it says in verse 1, it says, the whole world had one language and a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Verse 3, it says, they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. You might say, like, why is that an important verse? I like historicity. That means historical documents that prove their own validity. In the area of Shinar, it's probably Babylonia. There weren't actual stones. And we know that there weren't from like extra biblical sources. There were just mud. And so this line is one where I go, it's actually true. They were in a place that they didn't have stone and they made brick. And we know that that happened. So take that for what it's worth. Verse 4, it says, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that, and this is the key, we may make a name for ourselves, otherwise we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth. And this is quite the story. We have a better grasp of what the Table of Nations, scattering diverse people, and then you have this story in the middle of it. It is, in its place in the story of Genesis, the most harsh contradiction you can have, right? God has three sons from one guy, Noah, 70 different nations of people, and in the middle of that, you've got one people who are like, hey, let's get everybody, we all speak the same language, let's do some really awesome things so that we can make our name great. Right in the middle of it, because then you finish the story, it finishes like verse 9, and it continues on with Shem's family line. And a lot of things come up with this. The key thing with what we see in the Tower of Babel, and you can jot this down if you're the note taker, is that humanity often attempts to create greatness with sameness. We speak the same language, so we'll make a really tall tower. It literally was great. It wasn't, I mean, even God later, I mean, we'll read it in sec, says, if we don't break them up, what can they not do? They can do great things. And our intent then and now is to be collected into one location. We're tempted to make a name for ourselves. Even right now, look around. In this room, we're mostly really similar. We could do some really great things, and we might along the way be tempted to do it for ourselves. But it doesn't work like that. And it's not just true then. 170 BC, if you like history as well, like I do, there's a guy, he's the king of Syria. His name is Antiochus Epiphanes. And there's a thing in the ancient Near East, Middle East, where they would try and Hellenize culture. That means make them Greek. And this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, went around to everybody who wasn't Greek and would attempt to make them as Greek as possible. So for Jewish men, what's the identifying mark of a Jewish male? Circumcision. He would not allow men to be circumcised if they were Jewish, because Greeks didn't get circumcised. He would also tell other people they had to worship certain things and practice certain things, and if they didn't do it, he would kick them out of the country or kill them entirely. There's another guy that maybe you know a little bit more, and his name was Adolf Hitler. 1930s and 40s, and I don't need to tell you about what he was trying to do. And this is the thing about Hitler that's fascinating. He was attempting to make a master race, right? The Aryan race was his thing. And I just realized this morning, I don't know why he targeted Jews as much, and the interesting thing about when God's people that are Jewish do the one thing that Hitler did too, like trying to be all the same and make great things. But Hitler wants to do all things, have everybody be the same. You should even look identical, speak the same language, have the same political system, use the same currency, all that kind of stuff. And what Hitler did is great in one way. And I don't mean great good. What Hitler did was evil and atrocious. But if you study history, what Hitler was able to do with sameness was one of the most systematized ways to completely wipe out an entire people. The amount of numbers of people that he killed in the concentration camps and gas chambers is like bar none to most of our history that we know about. And you say, well, that's evil, and the word great also applies to that. It's great in magnitude. He did great things, but through sameness. Our country isn't pure of that, is it? In the 1850s, we had a court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. And in the court case, our Supreme Court justices ruled 7-2 that a person of African descent is not a citizen and shall never be a citizen of the United States. And I look at that, and the language they use out, the ruling, and I don't need to read that. I look at that and I go, 7 out of 9 ruled in favor of that. And I go, I don't think that those guys were trying to be evil. I don't think that they woke up and they're like, hey, let's ruin the lives of an entire group of people based on the color of their skin and the origin of their birth. Like, I don't think, I hope at least, I'm optimistic. But they were. And what were they trying to do? And we've done it, and I do it, is make greatness out of sameness. And what does God do? Turn back to Genesis 11, because that just got real heavy, right? Verse 5, it says, the Lord came down to see the city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if one people speaking the same language, they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand. And when you read stories in the Bible, I would just encourage you to take a minute and imagine it. Like, imagine you and I. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I was never in theater, but I'm gonna act a little bit. Imagine we're making bricks, right? And we're building the Tower of Babel. I say, hey, Dylan, will you pass me a brick, please? And he tosses one to me. And then I say this, Yeshioden Pozolsta. He gave me a thumbs up. I don't speak, this is Russian. Imagine we're all working and all speaking English, and then all of a sudden I say, hey, pass me a brick, and he hands me one, and I go, hey, Yeshioden Pozolsta. And he's like, and I say it again, Yeshioden, and he's like, do you need prayer? Like, what are your hands out for? You gonna play patty cake? And he can assume, right, Yeshioden Pozolsta in Russian, I'm trying, is pass me another one, please. But imagine we're doing this great thing, having a great church service, and all of a sudden we're singing Lion and the Lamb, and we all start singing it in a different language, and we're like, what in the world is happening? And what happens as a result of this? Read on. Where are we at? Verse 8. The Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building that city. That's why it's called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And this isn't just easy to do. The Lord scatters everything, and this idea of diversity and living life with differences is challenging. And you could say, well, Finnick, there's this idea that if you try and work with other people, you're just going to end up with battles. And I go, yeah, you will, because you look at American history, you look at world history, and most of the battles that we have were over religious differences, or skin differences, or political ideological differences, or economic differences, or whatever it might be. Even if you look at the Rwandan conflict with the Hutus and the Tutsis, they were the same country, but people came in and started identifying them as different shades of brown skin, and then there was this entire war that hundreds of thousands of people killed each other. And you go, surely differences aren't good, because those led to that. And I would say, yeah, it's really hard, but I wonder, this is a question I have, is it harder now than it was in the Old Testament? I'm curious, because what happens is that there is this idea that Jesus comes, he is the promised Messiah throughout the whole Old Testament. We have shalom, breaking it with sin, all of this stuff of war and conflict and conquest, and then Jesus comes and he starts saying things like, any who comes to me, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. He then says all these things to poor people, and then he challenges rich people, and he invites irreligious and really challenges hard the religious people who thought they had it all together. But there's this promise in Jesus that we all can be united together. Turn real quick to Ephesians chapter 3. I'm going to jump there. I don't know if I put this on the slides, guys. I'm kind of going out of order a little bit. Ephesians 3, Paul is writing, and if you don't know anything about Ephesians, it's a letter he wrote to a church, and the first 3 chapters are all what's true. And this is what he says in Ephesians 3, verse 6. He says, the mystery is that through the gospel, the Gentiles, that means everybody that's not Jewish, guys and girls, married and single, that's pretty much everybody, right? Husbands and not husbands, wives and not wives, is what he's saying. Jew and Gentile, everybody across the whole world. Verse 6. Are heirs together with Israel, members together of one body, and sharers together in the promise of Jesus Christ. He does an awesome thing in the Greek language. He uses the prefix syn, which is where we get the word synergy, S-Y-N, on each of those 3 terms when he says they are heirs together and members together and sharers together in the promise of Jesus. And he says this is the mystery that's been hidden for so long. No one knew that the promised Messiah would actually bring everybody back together. Most Israel thought that it would be their Messiah, that everybody would come up, but he would smite the people that didn't follow. And now in Jesus, Paul says to this church in Ephesus, no. What happens in Jesus is that everybody comes together, and now they are one, regardless of their difference. He then goes on, he says, this is the mystery, and this is the thing, church. Verse 10, he says, his intent was that now, through what? The church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. So, the mystery is this. In Jesus, we're one. The church is the way that he's going to tell the world about that. So my question is, why do we all speak the same language? Why do we all worship in the same ways? Why do we all have these different values? And there's another piece to this that I want to get into. And I'm sorry that this is all over. I'm having a hard time putting this together. I've really prayed a ton about this, and it's a heavy topic for me. But there's a counter story to the Tower of Babel that I've never connected before, and it's in Acts 2. Before the Pentecostals get all crazy, because we're reading Acts 2, right? We're going to do a little a linguistic study. It's super fun. You're going to be amped. Trust me. Acts 2. Bernita, you're going to be pumped. Trust it. So we said Babel was man attempting to achieve greatness with sameness. God comes down, breaks up their language, and then drives them out and scatters them, right? Acts 2. You ready? When the day of Pentecost came, they're all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each one heard their own language being spoken. I want to do something real quick. Keep your finger on Acts 2 and then turn back to Genesis 11. You ready? There's 4 words that are identical. In Acts 2, verse 4. Tongues. Can you underline that one? Or highlight it? That one's glosses in Greek. And then in Genesis 11, verse 7, language is the same Greek word. Okay, so the Spirit comes, gives everybody different languages so they can speak different languages. In Genesis 11, God's Spirit comes and breaks up everybody's language so they can't speak the same language. Next one. The crowd hears this sound. This is verse 6. Underline sound. That's the word phones. And then Genesis 11, verse 7. The end of that, the NIV says, will not understand each other. Some of you might have ESV and it says each other's words, or each other's language, or each other's noises. That's the word phones again. So in Acts it says that they were confused because they didn't understand. In Genesis 11 it says God's Spirit came down and confused them so they didn't understand. It happens again with two other words and then we're done. The languages of Genesis 11 verse 7 is glosson, and then Acts 2 verse 4 began to speak in other tongues is glossai. Did I get that one already? Okay, sorry. The last one, sorry. We'll just do one more. I'm trying to do this, it's hard. Des Spirit. Turn over to Acts 8. What does God do after He gives them the tongues? Chapter 8, verse 1, it says, on that day a great persecution broke out against the church. All except the apostles were scattered. Underline that word, scattered. It happens again in 8, verse 4. 11 says the Lord came down. Verse 9. Because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the whole earth. So what's happening? In creation, God's design was the best humanity, the fulfilling life, one with diverse people. Now in the upper room, God reconciles all people, not by creating a humanity-centered sameness, but by giving them a spirit-filled diversity. You see, the difference of this Genesis account and the Acts account couldn't be more stark. And so we then still are left with a question, right? Because now we see maybe there is unity in this diversity rather than unity in sameness. Because the temptation for me and for us, even today in this church, for me in my own life, is that if we want to do great things and we're doing them with people that are the same as us, we might be tempted to do great things for ourselves. If I asked you to pick your favorite song for us to sing in worship, we might have a bunch that are the same. And we might be able to do that one song really well, but that's really just for us. But is there other music that glorifies God and praises His name? Well, Revelation 7 says all people are going to be singing some songs. They're going to be singing in different languages, and it's all going to be honoring to Him. And so you could still have the question. I see some of your faces, and you're asking, so what does this mean for us as a church? How do we become diverse? And this is what I would say. If I'm a citizen of God's kingdom, what is the next step for me if this is true about God's path for diversity? If God wants us to be a really diverse church, what do we do other than just bring people of minority up in front or sing songs that are minority songs? I don't know what it might be. And I said this at the very beginning. This is my journey, and we're trying to work through it. But there's two things that I'm going to challenge you with, and we're going to take this away. Because God says in Ephesians through Paul that He has this multi-plan. It's diverse, and it's all people being one in Jesus, and the way He's going to tell the world about it is through the church. And if we're to be a church that is telling people that plan, and we're all white singing Chris Tomlin in English, how are they going to hear about it in Spanish, or in Swahili, or in Russian? And I get it, there's a lot of questions. Last one. Two things, and then we're done. The word displacement. You write that down. My challenge for a lot of you is that in this society, if you're four things, white, male, Protestant, and heterosexual, you don't have to go outside of your comfort zone very often. If you take away any one of those things, you find yourselves in circumstances where you are sometimes having to act a little bit differently. And particularly if you think about the race thing, if you are white, you generally can go anywhere in the country and you can act yourself and be widely accepted. If you want to go, you can find places, but you won't go unless you really want to. So there's this notion of displacement that if you are not white, not a male, not a Protestant, and not heterosexual, you regularly have to change how you talk about things. You can talk to any, I have a few African American friends, and they say oftentimes they have a way to speak when they're with one group of people, and then they have to change it when they're somewhere else. And that's called displacement. And so the way that we can start to see, like, what are some of the things that we maybe want to be about and maybe want to process and challenge would be, would you displace yourself? Now, I'll tell you one thing. It might sound not that exciting, but it's pretty fun. 2 ways that I've done it is at the gym. When we lived up in Huntersville, I would go to Fitness Connection, and I would go play basketball. And I was the only white dude in the gym. And I was tenuous at first. I had a lot of questions when I first went in. But after time getting there, you start to interact and see pieces of culture that you would never see before. And if I read this Bible that says that it's all about shalom and being one with other people, I want to learn as much as I can, and I'm never going to be forced to unless I place myself in this situation. I just heard a story about a mom of 6 kids. She lives in Indian Trail, Matthews. And she said, I want God to give me a passion for refugees. And she ended up finding a restaurant in Matthews that's hiring refugees and spends a lot of time there to take care of just learning what it looks like to displace yourself and put yourself in a different context. So the first challenge I would say, and you can have a lot of questions, I would welcome them. You can email me, you can talk to me after. If you're curious about like how would I do it, first step is displacement. This is the other thing, the other response, this is the last one. I asked Day, I said, what's our first step? I'm a white guy trying to tell people how to step into being diverse. I can't assume that I know the best things. And Day's wisdom, which has been a blessing for me, is he says, listen to gospel music. And I've talked about this before, about the things that happen with the diversity of gospel music, and there's just this beauty that starts to come when you start to listen to other people. And this is the step. If you never listen to gospel music, Praise 100, 100.9, keeping it 100, Willie Virginia on the radio. And this is the suggestion, is to find one song that you enjoy, and then start listening to that artist. When we first started this, we heard the song Ty Tribbett, What Can I Do? And I started listening to that song, and I tell you what, one day I was driving and I started singing the song because I've now memorized it. And I start finding myself being emotionally caught up in worship of a person that I had never listened to before and never even heard of 2 weeks prior. That there is something about music that can start to change your heart. And so, I'm going to invite the band up. I'm going to go ahead and be the awkward turtle real quick. I just feel like I've been all over the place on this. I know that generally you come here expecting top-notch message delivery and whatever it might be. What I want to say in summary, I don't know if I've ever said those words in a sermon. In sum, it's like a bad term paper. So are ones that go really long and ramble, right? Is I believe the biblical picture of what man's temptation is to create greatness around sameness. And I think the overarching narrative of what God is doing is saying he's already created greatness with spirit-driven diversity. And we as a church want to catch that. We want to figure out what that looks like and what it means. 2 steps. Figure out how to displace yourself. Start listening to gospel music. As we worship in the response to, I would encourage you, if you need prayer, there's going to be people in the back. If you have a journal, if you have questions right now, you think that I've said something that's rude or misguided or heretical or annoying, I would love to hear it. Because I'm in this journey just as